Okay, there we go. And I'm going to share my screen as well with you. Okay, right, yes. So medicine, it's going to make up a third of your final grade, and there is a lot to revise, and I'm going to help you with that now. So we're going to start off in the Middle Ages, and I'm going to bring up the online textbook. You should be familiar with this, and I'm going to whiz through the Middle Ages because it's something that I did last week on the not this one, it's this one, on the revision session that I did after school. So it's already online for you to watch, and it will be maybe in a little bit more detail than I'm going to do it in this morning. But I think you all already know this. A lot of you would be quite familiar with this when we go over it. It's just about learning it in a way that you can remember it without me asking you the leading questions. So let's start by thinking about disease and infection in the Middle Ages. Now, I can't see the chat bar while I'm using this. So if you've got a problem, like for example, if I cut out and you cannot hear me, somebody unmute themselves and say so, please, rather than me just talk and nobody be able to hear. Now, are you going to need this for the mock exam? Yes, there is an element of this section that you are going to need for the mock. Okay, it might not specifically ask you about Christian medicine, but you could use this as part of a bigger question, because I think we'd all agree that in many ways Christianity held medicine back, disease and infection back in Europe throughout the Middle Ages, because the church controlled education, which meant that they taught everybody that God sent illness as a punishment or a test of faith. So if you believe that, which everybody did, what would you do? You would pray, you would go on a pilgrimage, or you could even flagellate yourself to show God that you were sorry. Now, these were common practices throughout the Middle Ages, but the church did allow some more practical, scientific, natural ideas which had been around for a long time. Okay, so the four humors, which was philosophized, bad word, but the four humors which Hippocrates came up with back during the period of the ancient Greeks, and Galen built upon that with his theory of opposites, which was used throughout the Roman periods. And Galen's and Hippocrates' ideas were widely practiced throughout the Middle Ages. The church allowed them, maybe because they'd been around before the Christian church took control of Christian Europe in the Middle Ages. So maybe the church saw it as an easy option to allow these ideas to continue and just not allow anything new. And it was that idea that Hippocrates and Galen were promoted as the old masters that had done everything, and we weren't allowed to challenge them. And it was that which really kind of held medicine back throughout the Middle Ages. Okay, the church did do some good things throughout the Middle Ages. We can't slate the church too badly because it was a good entity and it set up hospitals. And if you have a look just at the bottom of the page there, it says 700 hospitals throughout the Middle Ages. So that is definitely a positive thing regarding disease and infection. But as you all should know, hospitals throughout the Middle Ages were places of care and not cure. And that was the big problem. Okay, so I'm already spending too long on this, so I want to whiz through. They had some understanding of contagious disease. Although they believed God sent it, they knew that spending too long next to somebody with a disease such as leprosy was a bad idea. They even had their own hospitals for leprosy patients, and they were called Lazar hospitals. So there was some understanding of contagious disease, but they just didn't build upon it because of their obsession with the church's teachings and the ideas put forward by Hippocrates Hippocrates and Galen. Clinical observation was another big thing throughout the Middle Ages, and that was something which Hippocrates promoted back during the Greek period, the ancient Greek period. So if you were sick in the Middle Ages in Christian Europe, who would you go to see? You would probably go to see a barber surgeon. They were the most common types, and they would use clinical observation as a way of diagnosing you, but along the Hippocratic and Galenic ideas of balance, okay? Their treatments would be based around trying to bring your body back into balance, and they would be based on natural and supernatural cures, a combination of everything. Okay, the supernatural is still an important part of diagnosing and treating illness throughout this period. Now, a common way of trying to bring your humours back into balance was to bleed. So take some of your blood. It could be used for toothache. It could be used for a stomach upset. Bleeding was a very common way of trying to cure people throughout the Middle Ages. They would make you vomit. The barber surgeon would also purge your system by giving you something that would act as a laxative. Astrology was also a big part of medicine throughout this period. Okay, and it all centered along this idea of bringing your body back into balance, alongside those supernatural techniques of prayer and pilgrimage and the other things that the church promoted, and everybody was religious during this period. Now, to say that there was no progress would be a lie, because as you can see in source A, there was urine analysis, and this is something that is still used today, not quite in the same ways that a barber surgeon would use it throughout the Middle Ages, but sorry, still letting people in, but nonetheless, an important development within medical diagnosis, diagnosing diseases and infections. Okay, right, that was the barber surgeon. Moving on now to the wise woman, which was another important person throughout the Middle Ages who would use natural and supernatural cures and treatments. Sorry, still more people coming in. Sudden influx. So make sure you can talk about the role of the wise woman alongside the medieval trained doctors, because for the first time in history, and this is a good thing that happened throughout the Middle Ages, not necessarily in line with the church, but you could now go and study to be a doctor. Doctoring became a profession for the first time in its history. Prior to this, if you wanted to be a doctor, you had to take on an apprenticeship. You had to find somebody that was going to teach it to you. Now you could go to university to study to be a doctor. And this was really important. You could go to Oxford and Cambridge. Salerno was the first medical school in Europe. That was in the 11th century in Italy. And they would use, and this is something I haven't necessarily made a big deal of, but it's important nonetheless, Gilbert Eagle's Compendium of Medicine, which was an important British medical textbook that had been used throughout the universities of the time, and it centered along the Greek idea of balance. Okay, drawing all over the textbook. Okay, so I'm going to whiz through this now. I'm going to move on. Right, Islamic medicine. Don't ignore Islamic medicine. Okay, it is something which often gets ignored, and when it comes up on the exam, it catches people out, because Islamic medicine was important for European medicine. They were doing lots of really progressive things in the Middle East that were not happening in Europe, but those ideas slowly filtered their way back into Europe. So once again, I don't want to spend long on this because it's already been highlighted in the last revision clip that I put online. So Baghdad, center of translation of old Greek manuscripts. It was a center of learning. That's important for medicine. The House of Wisdom, the largest library the world had ever seen. Okay, it's a center of study for scholars from all over the Middle East that would come there and talk and discuss new ideas. Really, really important place for the development of medicine. Their idea that God had also created cures as well as illnesses, that is an important aspect of their beliefs, which enabled their medical knowledge and understanding to flourish. Their attitude towards hospitals was very different to Christian hospitals. They were places of care and cure, which again is a very progressive idea. Make sure you do not forget this bit. Make sure you can talk about Rhazes and Avicenna as well. So I'm just going to leave that bit there and move on. Right, medieval surgery and anatomy. So their anatomical knowledge was based upon whom? I'm not going to wait for answers because I've got so much to get through, okay? So it's based upon Galen. Remember, Galen was the old master and we cannot challenge Galen. And what was his book called? On Anatomical Procedure. He had written it during the Roman period and it was still being used during the Middle Ages in Europe. Now, that's a good thing, okay? Because the book is a great thing. It's not bad. Some of you might say it was terrible. It's not. It's a really, really important book. It made many brilliant discoveries, such as the brain controls the body. But the big downside is he dissected animals and he made plenty of mistakes, and not being able to challenge those mistakes is the real shame during this period. Not the fact that Galen made them, the fact that people weren't allowed to build upon Galen's work. Okay, and that held anatomy back massively. So make sure you are aware of that. And surgery, well, surgery throughout the Middle Ages and throughout history up until the 1800s was simple. Simple surgery because of the problem of pain and infection. As a result of that, surgery had to be quick, so they could remove cysts and tumours, amputations, bloodletting, simple surgeries that could be completed very, very quickly. And still people died on the operating table, even when you were operating fast. And quite often infection set in because surgeons did not worry about washing their hands or changing their clothes or just operating on the battlefield. Okay, it was common practice. Okay, and as a result, surgery was not that effective. To some degree, okay? They were more skilled than you and I. Cauterization was an important aspect of surgery during this period, stopping blood loss, no ligatures quite yet, and cauterization was quick. And we've mentioned the issue of pain. Let's use a key word now, and that's the lack of anesthetics. They had no effective anesthetics. People could get drunk. They could use mandrake root or opium as a way of getting high, but it doesn't matter how high you are, how euphoric the feeling is. When they start chopping off your leg, you're not going to think it's funny anymore. So make sure you can talk about simple surgeries and make sure you can also talk about some individual surgeons. There's no question on the mock that's going to ask you about individuals. There often isn't, okay, but you do need to know these, some of them, if you are talking about medieval surgery during the Middle Ages. Now, my group, we focus on Hugh of Lucca, John of Ardern, and John Bradmore, which you do not see on this page. Okay, Mrs. Green's group, I'm sure you focus on the same ones and maybe some more. So just make sure you can talk about 2 or 3 of these in some detail. Okay, so that's medieval surgery. And let's move on to public health now. So first thing, can you talk about why public health was so bad in the Middle Ages? My group, I draw you back to the picture that we use all of the time, the same picture of that medieval city, where we see things like massive overcrowding, no sewers, no paved streets, lots of animal and human waste ending up on the streets and then into the rivers, the same rivers that you get your drinking water from and your water to cook with. Very, very few toilets. Conditions were terrible, okay? Very, very bad. And they got worse as populations increase. But there are some developments throughout the Middle Ages. We had privies, some, not lots, which were toilets. So we're getting people to poo and pee in the same area, which is quite good. It means it's not ending up on the streets, but we didn't have enough privies. Underneath the privies, we have cesspits to gather that waste, and then gong farmers to dig that waste out of the cesspits. Sorry, still letting people in. So there were some developments regarding public health during the Middle Ages, but unfortunately there was no government intervention. Public health was personal, which meant that it was left up to the person to get their drinking water, to get rid of their waste, and all too often that waste ended up on the streets. The butchers threw their waste into the rivers, the leather tanneries that used dangerous chemicals. Those chemicals often ended up in the water supply as well, the same water that you're getting your drinking water from. So it was an unhealthy system of disease and infection. It was a cycle of disease and infection. Now, did towns and councils try to do something about it? It was difficult because they didn't really understand what was causing disease. They did blame much of it on bad air and still an imbalance of the humours and still God, but that lack of understanding often led to inaction because they didn't really know what they were doing. But some laws were passed to improve the situation, and you can see two I've highlighted there. In 1371 it was made illegal to kill large animals inside of the city walls of London, and in 1388 a law was passed which fined people £20 for throwing rubbish, garbage, dung, entrails, stuff from animals that you don't want to eat in ditches, ponds and rivers. So there was some attempt to make improvements, but too often these laws were not enforced, and as a result things did not get better. Okay, where were things better? In the countryside that didn't have a big population, and in the monasteries, because the monasteries had lots of money. So make sure you are aware of some of the public health systems that the monasteries had, like systems of piped water, filtering systems to remove the dirt from water, a lavatorium, which was basically a washroom. These are public health systems that everybody could have if enough money was thrown at it. The monasteries, the church had lots of money. There is a factors question on public health. So if you're talking about science and technology as a factor which actually brought about good public health, then you could potentially talk about these systems. Okay, why did the church have these systems? Well, they had money. The churches were very wealthy. They were rich landowners, and lots of people donated money to the church, and it was used in these monasteries in a very scientific way. Monks were educated and disciplined. They had access to the old manuscripts from the Greek period. Hippocrates didn't just preach about the four humours, he preached about living a balanced lifestyle. So exercising regularly, getting a good night's sleep, washing, not drinking too much alcohol. So yeah, these ideas of living a balanced lifestyle, monks often followed them. Diet, meditation, sleep, exercise. So yes, make sure you are aware of these public health systems and why the monks and the monasteries were so healthy. Now, the Black Death. I know I'm moving at pace because there's a lot to go through, and it's always nice, I think, to hear the whole of the medicine story as one. We do it in stages in class, and that's good in many ways. It helps you to remember more, but to hear it as one big long story often helps you to put things in its place. So the Black Death throughout the Middle Ages, you can look upon this from a disease and infection point of view and a public health point of view, because the public health response to this was organised in some way, and obviously it is a disease and an infection. So what did people believe the Black Death was being caused by? Well, they believed it was God. They believed it was an imbalance in your humours. They believed it was bad air. They had lots of beliefs because none of them really made sense, because everything they tried simply did not work. Because the Black Death was spreading so very quickly because of the poor public health conditions that people were living in the cities. It was common in the countryside as well, but it was the filth that littered the streets. It gave the rats a perfect environment to breed. Overcrowding meant that victims were very close together, and all of this created a perfect breeding environment for the disease, and it spread incredibly quickly. Now, there was some organised approach in dealing with this. Local councils did try to quarantine infected places, but it just wasn't on a big enough scale to have much of an impact. It was widely left up to the individual to try to deal with his or her family's infection. And that was the big letdown. When the Black Death comes back during the Renaissance, the 1600s, there's a much more organised approach to deal with it, and that leads to fewer cases. So, the Black Death, you know what caused it. Is there a specific question on the Black Death that you need to be aware of? No, there's not, but you do need to be aware of it from a public health point of view, because there is a factors question on public health, and you might want to talk about how this was dealt with from a scientific point of view, from a government point of view. So, consequences of the Black Death. There were some significant consequences. Food rotted in the fields. There were food shortages, especially in the towns and the cities, because many of the peasants had been killed. The food that was in the field was now rotting, and there were less peasants to grow more of it. It led to hardship and future deaths. Okay? Inflation, the price of food went up. Makes sense because there's less of it. But there were some positives, because peasants were in a very powerful position all of a sudden. Before the Black Death, the lords took advantage of the peasants to work the land in an uneven deal. The peasants often had to work on the lord's land for 40 days every year for free. Well, now all of a sudden, the peasants were in demand. They could negotiate for better wages. They could negotiate to work less time on the lord's land. They could even move manors. Beforehand, under the feudal system, peasants were tied to the local lord's land. They simply could not leave and move anywhere else. Well, now, although that system was still in place, there was much more scope for peasants to move between manors. In some ways, it was encouraged. If I was short of peasants, I might try to poach some of them from the neighbouring manor, because as a lord, I need those peasants to work the land. So there were definitely some pros and cons to the Black Death for the survivors. Okay, so that is something that you need to be aware of. Do you need to know it in absolute masses of detail? No, you don't. Okay, but definitely be aware of what we've just spoken about. And then lastly, just at the bottom, I've just seen it. It did affect, in some ways, the church's influence over society, because people relied upon the church as kind of an authority. You ask the church's advice and opinions, and you listen to what the church says. So when the church's advice and opinions failed people throughout this period, the church's teachings in many ways didn't make sense anymore. And some people lost faith in the church, and the church's influence over society definitely weakened. Its reputation had been damaged in many ways. Okay, so that was the Middle Ages. Let's now move on to the Renaissance. We're going to do the same. We'll look at disease and infection, public health, and surgery and anatomy. So just really quickly, during the Renaissance, before we get into those three themes, there were some big changes that happened to medicine that had nothing to do with medicine. Okay, some big developments that happened because of these changes. And the first one was a change in attitude. Throughout the Middle Ages, there was this reliance upon Galen and Hippocrates and what was written in the books, not to challenge what was written in the books, because Galen and Hippocrates have done everything there is to do for medicine, okay? And there's nothing left to discover. That was the attitude throughout the Middle Ages. Now we're in the Renaissance. There was this big change in people's attitudes in normal people, but also within the scientific realms. They didn't want to just rely upon what was written in the books anymore. They wanted to do their own experiments, their own tests, to prove what was written in the books, but also to develop it with new ideas. This was the rebirth of the old ways of doing things. Hippocrates and Galen didn't rely upon what was written in the books. They wrote the books through their own experiments and their own tests and their own inquiries. And that was good, that was healthy. And for some reason, the church, we had this really bad attitude throughout the Middle Ages where we didn't build upon that. Well, now we're in the Renaissance, we're not going to make the same mistakes again. So many new doctors and scientists, they were all about doing their own experiments to try to prove if what was written in the books was true, but also to build upon that. And that was brilliant for medicine. It was brilliant for science, brilliant for the world. Okay, so that was one big development that had nothing to do with medicine, but impacted medicine in a big way. Next big development was art. You can see it in front of you. There was a focus on realism. That is a sketch by Da Vinci. And just below it there, source A, that's the nervous system, actually. So it's quite a technical drawing, but you see the style of drawing. It's very cartoon-like, and that's not going to help anatomists at all. The picture you see in front of you, source B, where you can see the muscles, the tendons, the ligaments that join the muscles to the body, that's going to help an anatomist. So sketches like that, which are now commonplace throughout the Renaissance, would help surgery and anatomy massively. And lastly, you can see it over here, source C, the printing press. Up until this point, books like On Anatomical Procedures and Razi's books and Avicenna's book, The Canon of Medicine, it all had to be copied out by hand. And that's not brilliant for the spread of knowledge. It means that the spread of knowledge is going to be very slow, very expensive, and it's open to mistakes. And even sometimes monks would change bits that didn't actually fit the idea of the church's teaching. So it wasn't always as reliable as you would hope. But now we have printing, and it made the spread of knowledge much more accessible, okay, between kingdoms, between religions, between places. So let's move on to disease and infection. And this is important, okay, because this influences medicine now right up until Pasteur. So you definitely should be revising this specifically, okay? Okay, good. Right, so what was the treatment of disease and infection like throughout the Renaissance? Well, we still blamed it on God. There was still lots of prayer, there were still people going on pilgrimage, but there was more scope for new ideas. Before we got into the new ideas, the four humours were still important throughout this period as well. The doctors of this age, the barber surgeons, which were still around, the apothecaries, the quacks, talk more about them in a bit, they would still promote treatments that focused on balancing your humours. You still blamed disease on bad air. People still walked around smelling sweet-smelling herbs. But the treatment of disease really did develop during this period. This period can be classified as a period of try everything. Okay, we're not going to just limit it to bloodletting and purging and vomiting and trying to bring humours back into balance. This period was, right, we're just going to try everything and see what works. And that's really good for medicine, that trial and error approach. Not necessarily good for the patients that are being experimented on, but it is good because you see what works and what doesn't work. And a good example to prove this is when we look at Charles II. When poor old King Charles got sick with a kidney disease, his royal physicians, doctors, Owen's having a really hard time joining. So if any of you talk to Owen, then tell him I'm trying to let him in, but he's either getting thrown out all of the time or it's not letting him in. Either way, sorry. So 58 different drugs were tried on Charles II. He was bled, he was blistered, he was cauterized. They used all sorts of different herbal remedies to try to cure his kidney disease. They didn't know he had a kidney disease. And he even tried mercury, which could have actually pushed him closer to death. But either way, this was a period of try everything, and that's important, okay? If you were to ever get a question that asks you about the treatment of disease up until the 1800s, well, this was still being used, these ideas were still being used right up until Pasteur's germ theory, okay? So what was now being practiced in the Renaissance is important right up until Pasteur. So please be aware of that, revise that, think about that. Okay, so what else? We had some new doctors, I suppose we can call them doctors, medical practitioners throughout this period. You have the apothecaries, so important right up until Pasteur, and they are kind of, we think about them as like the pharmacy today. You go into an apothecary shop and he would have all sorts of potions and powders and liquids that would cure all sorts of different ailments. And there was still an element of supernatural medicine attached to this, because you might have to take a potion while saying a spell, or during a certain time of the year when the planets are in alignment. There was an element of supernatural medicine still being practiced throughout this period. It had not gone away. Quacks were more like a traveling apothecary, a traveling salesman. They would sell you all sorts of cure-all ingredients. Many of them were just pure lies. They would not work, because by the time you realized they would not work, the quack had gone to a different town, a different village, and it would be almost impossible for you to get your money back. Okay, but already mentioned, this was a period of try everything, and herbal remedies were much more common throughout this period than ever before. And Culpeper's The Complete Herbal is a good example of a herbal medicine medical book. It combined the use of plants and minerals and herbs and loads of things with astrology and also some other supernatural treatments. So here's an example of how medicine was developing. Disease and infection was developing during this period. But remember, it's still this period of try everything. We're not sure, so we're going to try all sorts of different things. Apothecaries and quacks were examples of that. And also, this is a period of empire building. We sailed around the world conquering new lands, and with new lands came new bits and pieces, and it was almost kind of expected that we use the bits and pieces. And one example of that is tobacco. Tobacco was smoked by the rich, but it was also used in medicine as a cure-all ingredient. It could cure absolutely everything and anything. Things such as toothache, the plague, period pain, even, ladies. Tobacco could cure it all. And I use a picture in my class, you can probably remember it, my group, of that person having tobacco smoke blown up their backside, which was one method of administering tobacco as a way of curing illness. Now, I'm sure it gave the doctor a little bit of a laugh, and it definitely wouldn't cure illness, but it is another example of this period being a period of try everything. So let me continue with this briefly. So the Great Plague, let's focus on this from a disease and infection point of view. Had they developed any new beliefs about what was causing the Great Plague? No, it was still being blamed on God, but less so. It was still being blamed on the four humours. Miasma, bad air, was a very popular explanation for the Great Plague when it came back during 1665. The real reason why it was spreading was because public health had deteriorated to a great deal, and I'm going to talk to you about a little bit about that in a moment. Okay, so public health had gone down the pan and disease was spreading much quicker. And the Great Plague is the Black Death, but they called it the Great Plague, came back a number of times and terrorized the big cities, most notably in 1665. Now, their approach to it was still somewhat ineffective. They still burnt barrels of sweet-smelling wood and tar in the streets. People walked around smelling bundles of sweet-smelling herbs based on the idea it was being spread by the bad air, by miasma. People still prayed lots. Unfortunately, did not have much of an effect on the spread of that disease. People would go on pilgrimage. These things didn't really work, but one thing that really did develop during this period, and this was regarding public health, was a more scientific and organised approach to this epidemic disease by the councils and the governments. Okay, and this is the important thing regarding public health, but it can also be linked into disease and infection. Okay, so quarantine was a big development during this period. Let me just try to find it in the textbook down there. Okay, quarantine with big red crosses on the door to warn people that plague victims live in this house and not to get too close. Okay, they didn't know about disease being caught from individuals. Well, they did, that's the thing. They simply did not understand it, but they knew being close to infected individuals was not a good thing. You had watchmen who stood guard and women searchers who searched the streets at night trying to find the dead and ensure that they were buried in effective graves, big plague pits that were deep, 6 feet under. We had bills of mortality, which not that one. There you go. There's a bill of mortality which outlined all the deaths within the city, what they died of and whereabouts in the city. So this enabled people to start linking dirt with disease for the first time, because they would look at this and they would see that the most numbers of death in the city are all linked to certain areas, the most filthy areas within society. But they would go to those areas and it would stink, and they would blame miasma, bad air, for the spread of disease. So yes, although there was still very little understanding of the Great Plague, there was a more scientific approach in dealing with it. From a personal point of view, people still believed that it was being spread by frogs and snakes, and they would use chickens and pigeons in their treatments. Remember shaved chicken bottoms? And even frogs were still being used to try to suck the poison out of the buboes. Didn't really work. But yeah, it still illustrates that this was a period of try everything regarding disease and infection. From a public health point of view, all public health was getting worse. So all of those problems that we mentioned for the Middle Ages, so the overcrowding had gotten worse, which means there was more human and animal waste on the streets. There were still no sewers. There were privies, more toilets, but they weren't always emptied. There were dung heaps on the streets, and when it rained, they flowed down the streets under people's doors and into houses and basements. So public health was getting worse, which resulted in more diseases, more infections. Councils' approaches to some of those diseases and infections were actually now becoming more developed, and we see that when we move to the industrial period. So let me just go back now to surgery and anatomy. Now, there are no specific questions on Vesalius, Paré and Harvey, but you do need to know who they are and what they did as part of bigger questions. Okay, so you're not going to have to write an account of any of them. You're not going to have to write in masses of detail, but you do need to know the work of Paré, Vesalius and Harvey. And I'm going to use a different book just to talk to you about those guys, because I think this book is a little bit better. So you should be able to see another textbook now in front of you. Let me minimize it a little bit. Okay, so let's pick up surgery just briefly. What was going on with surgery? Not a lot to tell you the truth. It was still limited by the problem of pain and infection, which means that surgery still had to be very, very quick, which meant it was limited in what you could do. We were still removing cysts and tumours. They were still amputating. They'd got more skilled in amputation, but it was still about the limit on what you were able to do regarding surgical procedures. They were dealing with gunshot wounds, and we'll talk to you more about those in a minute when we get on to PARE. So there weren't huge developments within surgery. There were more developments within anatomy, because once again, this is a period where they are more willing to challenge the old ideas, to do their own experiments and build upon the old work of the masters. And one such person who built upon the work of the old masters is Vesalius. Now, Vesalius was an anatomist who respected Galen in a massive way, okay? He spoke very fondly of Galen and told the world what he'd learnt from Galen. But he did something slightly different, okay? And, excuse me, I've just remembered one of the things that I should have spoken about a little bit more, maybe when we looked at surgery and anatomy throughout the Middle Ages, because one of the things that did develop throughout the Middle Ages was dissection. Dissection was allowed throughout the Middle Ages, but because of Galen being the old master and their belief in anatomical procedures being the most up-to-date anatomical book, surgeons did not dissect to learn new information. They dissected to prove Galen right, and that was common throughout the Middle Ages regarding anatomy. And Vesalius knew this, and he knew the problem of trying to prove Galen right. He knew through his own dissections of human beings that Galen had made a number of mistakes, and he set about correcting some of those mistakes, the ones that he spotted. And he wrote these corrections, these new ideas up in a number of books, but his crowning glory was called The Fabric of the Human Body, and it was the most up-to-date anatomical book the world had ever seen. And in a very respectful way, he challenged some of the misconceptions, some of the old ideas, mistakes that Galen had made. And one of the things that he was able to prove is that the jawbone, I haven't got a highlighter on this. Oh, I have got a highlighter. 1 second, somebody wants to join us. So he was able to prove No, it's not working. Okay, not to worry, can't highlight it. Okay, so Vesalius was able to prove that the jawbone came in one part. It was made from one bone and not two, as Galen said. He was able to prove that the breastbone had 3 parts and not 7. And he was also able to prove that blood does not flow through invisible holes in the septum, which is kind of the center of the heart. In animals it does, but those holes do not exist in humans. And Vesalius is able to challenge more of Galen's mistakes, but these are some of the big ones, and these are 3 that I think you should remember within your explanations about Vesalius. If you're going to talk about what Vesalius was able to do, he challenged Galen, which is a very big deal, because up until Vesalius, dissections have been carried out to prove Galen right, not to discover new information. And here is Vesalius discovering new information and challenging Galen in a very respectful way. Okay, there's a little bit more to say about Vesalius, but I'm very conscious of time and I do want to move on. Okay, so that is anatomy. Another anatomist throughout the Renaissance that had a big impact on medicine was William Harvey. And Harvey, just like Vesalius, challenged Galen. Galen had said that blood was made in the liver and used up as a fuel as it went around the body. Now, Harvey, if you can just see the bit I'm circling down here, Harvey was able to build upon the work of others, okay, and come up with a new theory about blood and the heart acting as a pump. So a previous teacher, not of Harvey, but a previous individual that had done a lot of research into blood, was Colombo, and he had discovered that blood moved along veins and arteries. Fabricius, who was Harvey's teacher, had built upon this and proved that there were valves in veins controlling the direction of blood flow. Now, with these two pieces of information, Harvey is able to carry out experiments that proved that blood flowed in one direction around the body and went around and around and around. It circulated. It was not used as a fuel and was not made in the liver, not continuously anyway, as Galen suggested. Now, what was one of his experiments that enabled him to prove this? Well, he dissected cold-blooded animals whilst they were alive so he could calculate blood flow, okay? And using simple mathematics, he was able to prove within animals that new blood was not being made. If new blood was being made all of the time, there'd be so much blood in these animals' bodies that they would explode. Okay, you don't need to know the calculations or the experiment or anything like that. Just be aware that he dissected cold-blooded animals to prove his theory. He wrote it down. Vesalius wrote all about his ideas, as did Harvey. Harvey's book, An Anatomical Account of the Motion of the Heart and Blood. It's an interesting title, isn't it? Is it here anywhere? I'm sure it's somewhere. Not to worry, I've just said it and I'm recording this so you'll be able to play it back at a later date. So those are developments in anatomy and some developments in surgery. Remember, not a lot was going on in surgery because of the problem of pain, lack of anesthetics, and the problem of blood loss. So Paré the surgeon. He spent 20 years as an army surgeon, very important. If you're talking about his importance, that would be something that you would focus on. He was a surgeon to the kings of France, and he wrote a series of books called 10 Books on Surgery, which were very important. It was like a surgical manual on how to carry out different operations. And one of the important surgical treatments of this age was gunshot wounds. Gunshot wounds had replaced arrow wounds as one of the most common battlefield wounds. And being a battlefield surgeon, he treated them many, many times. Now, their traditional method of treating gunshot wounds was to use boiling oil, to pour it directly into a wound, or to soak a rag in it and ram it into the wound. They felt this would draw out the poison, and to stop the bleeding, they would use cauterization. Some pretty primitive treatments. It's a sign that surgery had not really advanced that much. We're still burning wounds shut, and they're pouring boiling oil directly into gunshot wounds as a way of trying to draw out the poison. They felt that gunpowder was poisonous. Now, how did Paré change things? Right, just by chance, Paré ran out of boiling oil, and he mixed together a new ointment of egg yolks, just down here, oil of roses and turpentine. And this new ointment had a much better healing quality than the boiling oil. And it was just by chance, sheer luck, that he ran out of boiling oil. You could argue that war played a part as well, because he was engaged in a war when he ran out of boiling oil, and also individual brilliance, because he came up with something nobody else had. He also came up with ligatures to stop bleeding instead of cauterization, which is a much better way. It's something that we still use today. Having said that, he was just ahead of his time because they didn't know about germs, and as a result, they spread infection as they were trying to tie off the blood vessels. And he also developed prosthetic limbs. They'd been around for a while, but he developed and developed them in a much more technological way. The one that you can see in front of you was made by a skilled armorer who developed these different hinges and mechanisms. This is on Pare's design, by the way, so that if you flicked a switch, the hand would actually close so it could grasp a sword, so you could potentially fight with it. So those are the three big individuals, and they will help you to explain the developments regarding surgery and anatomy throughout the Middle Ages. No, not Middle Ages, is it? It's the Renaissance. So let's continue. Let's now move on to the industrial period. Actually, it's worth mentioning hospitals just briefly. Hospitals at the end of the Renaissance, beginning of the industrial period. This is where we see a massive shift away from the hospitals of the past. The hospitals of the Middle Ages were very much controlled by the church. Now we're into the Renaissance, and now moving to the end of the Renaissance, we see a shift towards normal people building hospitals. They might be religious, but they were not fanatical religious people, which meant that the hospitals that developed during this period were places of care and cure. You have businessmen like Thomas Guy, you have private entities like banks, you even have private subscription where people in a local area might club together to build a hospital. Private subscription, where are you? It's just there. And because of this move away from the church's influence, these hospitals became places of care and cure, and they resembled much more the hospitals that we see today. There were medical schools attached to it. Doctors received training. There were actually doctors there, which simply was not the case during the Middle Ages. You have hospitals that start to specialize, more specialisms, such as hospitals for the mentally ill. You can see that just here. Hospitals for venereal diseases, even maternity hospitals were becoming more common during this period. Sorry, so I have a cold. So yes, hospitals, big developments during this period. Please make sure you can talk about that. You can use this as part of bigger questions where you're talking about the treatment of diseases throughout this period. And just at the bottom, it talks about how the end of the Renaissance saw this hospital building boom. And by the 1800s, there were hospitals in London handling 20,000 patients a year. And that's quite a lot. And if you're going to talk about important developments regarding diseases and infection during this period, you could even talk about this as a public health question. But regarding disease and infection, yes, this period was a period of try everything, but also hospitals had developed and were becoming far more specialized and just becoming better at treating diseases and infections. So that brings us up to the end of the Renaissance and the beginning of the industrial period from about 1750 up until 1900, so about 150 years. Now, John Hunter was a bit of a jack of all trades. He was a surgeon, he was a doctor, he was a very important person who influenced many surgeons and doctors who came after him. So once again, if you're talking about disease and infection throughout the Renaissance and then up to Pasteur, this is an important person who you could use in your answers if you're talking about disease and infection from, let's say, the 1700s up to the 1800s. So John Hunter, what was he involved in? This highlights how he's a bit of a jack of all trades. He wrote books on teeth, sexually transmitted diseases. Where are we? So here we go. The Natural History of Teeth. Books on venereal diseases, and even a book on blood inflammation and gunshot wounds, which just shows that he was involved in many different practices. regarding his teaching, this is what we need to remember him for, because he taught some of the most important doctors of the 1800s, and not only those doctors passed on their techniques, or Hunter's techniques, to future generations of doctors, and Hunter taught the scientific approach. And this becomes very evident when we think about Edward Jenner, and we're going to talk about Edward Jenner regarding disease infection in a moment. Okay, Hunter taught the idea that you need to come up with a test, you need to come up with an experiment to prove your theories. Okay, you need to base your theories and your discoveries in science. And an example of this is when he was researching gonorrhea and syphilis. He was convinced that they were separate diseases. Many people at the time thought that they were the same disease. He was convinced that they were not. So he set about infecting himself. He infected himself with gonorrhea first, because he wanted to, this was his scientific experiment, he wanted to prove that gonorrhea had different symptoms to syphilis. Now, unfortunately for Hunter, the patient who had gonorrhea also had syphilis, and Hunter infected himself with both diseases at exactly the same time, and he nearly died. It took him 3 years to get better. But that's not the important bit. The important bit is the method that he used, this scientific method that he went on then to teach to future generations. And if we think about Jenner and Pasteur and Koch and Fleming, who made such important discoveries, they all used the scientific method. Whether it came from Hunter or not, they were using science to prove their theories. So Hunter, very important from a scientific method point of view. You don't really need to know anything about specimens. Scientific method is the bit to focus on. So let's get on to Jenner. I don't really like this bit for Jenner, so let's go to this one. Okay, so Jenner was all about vaccinations. Hopefully you know about that. He came up with the very first vaccine that the world had ever seen. So an important aspect of disease and infection. And this happened right at the end of the 1700s and the beginning of the 1800s. So if you ever get questions that ask you about the treatment of disease throughout the 19th century, which is the 1800s, this is stuff that you can talk about, so be aware of that. Vaccinations for smallpox. What were the treatments of smallpox before vaccination? Well, not much really. You usually died if you got smallpox. It was a horrible, horrible disease. But they were using a method called inoculation. Why can't I underline? Maybe I can draw. Can I draw? Let's try black. There we go. That's a bit better, isn't it? Not much. Okay, so inoculation was being used as a way of trying to treat smallpox before Jenner came along with his vaccination. And Lady Montagu brought this idea back from Turkey. And she was so convinced about it, she actually inoculated her daughter in front of some very important doctors in England. Now, inoculation is a risky business because it involves infecting somebody with the disease that you are trying to protect them from. So we take smallpox, usually from a survivor, and we infect a healthy person in the hope that they will get smallpox, but only develop a mild version of it, get better, and then never catch it again. Now, you can obviously see the dangers from that. You couldn't guarantee that you would only get a mild version of smallpox. And some people went on to develop full-blown smallpox and then die from it. But nonetheless, it was still popular. People would pay up to £20, which is a hell of a lot of money, to be inoculated. And it just goes to show people's fears that they are willing to spend so much money on on a treatment. But inoculation was big business, and it was the way of treating smallpox before Jenner come along. But Jenner was Sir Hunter's student. He knew all about the importance of testing, experimenting, and careful observation. And Jenner, being a country doctor, had a theory. He knew, and this was common, people had spoken about this before, that it seemed that milkmaids never got smallpox. Even when smallpox was devastating a village, quite often milkmaids were unaffected. And Jenner's theory was that it was because they had already caught a disease called cowpox, and it was the cowpox that was protecting them from the smallpox. So Jenner set up an experiment where he commandeered the services of a young boy about 8 years old. His name was James Phipps. He infected James Phipps with cowpox taken from Sarah Nelms. James got poorly, then he got better because cowpox does not kill you. And then the really dangerous part of the experiment, and this shows Jenner's bravery. You wouldn't get away with this now, would you, experimenting on a young boy? It's like, got to be illegal. But he gave Jenner smallpox. Smallpox is a killer, but Jenner was convinced that the cowpox was going to protect James. And you know what? He was right. And he did this 23 other times before he published his report, okay, proving that cowpox protects you from smallpox. Now, unfortunately for Jenner, even though he did this 23 separate times, there was still plenty of opposition to him because people still believed in God. They still believed that it was wrong to infect yourself with an animal disease. The church had big influence over people's lives. The Royal Society refused to publish Jenner's work. Why? Because Jenner could not explain what was happening. He just knew that cowpox protected you from smallpox, but he could not explain how. Also, some other really important doctors did not get the same results that Jenner got. They didn't follow his methods closely enough, and as a result, some of their patients still got smallpox, and as a result they rubbished Jenner's ideas. But before long it did catch on. What's the bit I'm looking for? Especially when the government gave Jenner £30,000 to develop his work. And in 1852 vaccination became compulsory in Britain. Okay, so a little bit about Jenner. You don't need to know everything about Jenner, but you do need to be able to use his information as part of a bigger question. Okay, and that means that you don't need to revise every single word that you see on this page and remember every single bit of detail, but you do need to be able to write in detail about Jenner as part of a bigger question. Right, let's keep going because I'm very conscious about time. So Pasteur, now obviously Pasteur's a really, really important character, isn't he? So I would be revising Pasteur if I were you. So let's have a look at his rivalry with Koch and what they were able to achieve. So Louis Pasteur, Robert Koch, they hated each other. Louis Pasteur, France, Robert Koch, Germany. Both countries had been engaged in a war previously and their countries disliked each other. So each scientist wanted to outdo the work of the other to win prestige for their own country. So this is where disease and infection really starts to change because Pasteur comes up with germ theory. Prior to this, people believed in spontaneous generation. The idea that germs spontaneously generate out of decay. And it makes sense. If you look at a piece of meat under a microscope, you might see some germs. You let that meat decay for a week, and then you see lots more germs. You let that meat decay for a month, it probably goes bad now, and you look at it under a microscope and you see loads of germs, like loads and loads and loads. It looks like the germs are being caused by decay. Now, that was the common theory regarding germs, almost like they're a byproduct from decay and they don't need to be worried about. Well, unfortunately, that was wrong. And Pasteur finally proves why people get sick, and he proves that it's all down to germs. They don't mysteriously generate from decay. They're actually everywhere and they cause decay / disease. Now, how is Pasteur able to prove that? Well, he starts to work with wine. He's called into the alcohol industry in France because wine seems to be going sour, and he's able to prove that there is an extra microbe. Using microscopes, he's able to prove that there is an extra microbe in the sour liquid, and he feels that it's that microbe that is causing the liquid to go sour. He also proves that if you gently heat the liquid, it will kill those microbes, and he calls this pasteurization. Now, he sets about coming up with an experiment, the scientific method, to prove that germs in the air cause liquids to go sour. And this is a swan neck flask experiment, where he takes 2 swan neck flasks, he fills them with a liquid, he heats the liquid to pasteurize them, so there are no germs in the liquids, and he snaps one of the necks of the flasks off, allowing the outside to get in, the germs to fall into that liquid. And the liquid in the flask with the broken neck goes sour after a few weeks. The liquid with the swan neck intact, which prevents the germs from the air falling into the liquid, stays fresh. And he comes up with a theory that it would stay fresh for over 100 years because you are stopping the outside getting in. He is proving that germs cause decay in liquids. So then he gets called in to work with silkworms, and he's able to prove, just like he does with liquids, that germs in the air cause silkworms to get sick. And this is the big breakthrough for Pasteur, because silkworms are animals, just like humans. And if germs can make silkworms sick, then germs in the air can also make humans sick. And this was his germ theory. It disproved spontaneous generation, okay, and came up with something brand new, which set disease and infection down the correct road for the first time in human history. We now know why people get sick. It's not God. It's not the 4 humors. It's not bad air, okay? It's actually germs in the atmosphere. So this is a massive breakthrough. So if you're talking about him being important, significant, you would talk about this, okay? So let's move on to see how Koch built upon this. Remember, Koch hates Pasteur, but he builds upon Pasteur's work. He builds upon germ theory, and he's the first scientist to isolate an individual germ that causes an individual disease. He basically proves that individual germs cause individual diseases. And this is really important. It's a massively important step forward in our understanding of disease and infection. And he's able to isolate the germ that causes anthrax. He also develops a high-powered photographic lens, so he can take pictures of the germs, so you can actually see now what they look like. So if you're looking under a microscope and you see a specifically shaped germ, you can now start looking them up in books, an encyclopedia of different germs that cause different diseases. This became known as the age of the microbe hunter, and Koch kicked that off. Scientists kind of scrambling over themselves to try to find different germs and prove what diseases they cause. Okay, so a high-powered photographic lens, and he also used industrial dyes to stain the bacteria so you could see them easier under a microscope. So that's Robert Koch. Now on to Pasteur again. They go tit for tat for a little bit. Now, Pasteur uses Koch's research methods to isolate a germ that is causing chicken cholera. He's now called into the chicken industry. Lots of chickens are dying, and he uses Koch's technique to isolate the germ that causes chicken cholera. And Koch's none too happy about that. We'll talk about that in a moment. And by now, Pasteur is using a research team. The French government is paying for that. So this is another important step forward in disease and infection. From this point on, we see scientists and doctors working as parts of teams rather than being individuals making their own discoveries. So he's researching chicken cholera, and this is when his research assistant, Charles Chamberlain, leaves the chicken cholera germs out over the summer. When he gets back, he sees the chicken cholera germs in the syringe and thinks, oh, I was meant to inoculate the chickens. So he quickly gives the chickens the chicken cholera, which had been left out over the summer, expecting the chickens to get sick and die, but they don't. He goes to tell Pasteur. And Pasteur says, okay, maybe it was something about those germs that you left out over the summer. So go and get some fresh chicken cholera germs and infect the chickens. They're definitely going to get sick this time. So they infected the chickens with the fresh germs, and the chickens don't get sick. They take the same fresh germs just to test them and infect a different batch of chickens. Those chickens get sick and die. The only difference is the chickens, the first batch, they had had the syringe that had been left out over the summer. And this gave Pasteur the idea that those chicken cholera germs had weakened to such a degree that when they were infected into the chickens, they are so weak that it gave the chicken's own immunity system, their own antibodies, a chance to develop, fight the chicken cholera germs, and then make the body immune to them in the future. And this was the beginning of vaccinations. Pasteur then used this knowledge to develop a vaccine for anthrax. And this is really where Koch became upset, because Koch was the first person to discover the anthrax germ, and now Pasteur has developed a vaccine for it. He feels that Pasteur has ripped off his research, and in some ways they had, but this is the age of sharing of knowledge. Robert Koch wrote about his ideas, he wrote about his techniques, as did Pasteur, and they were able to read each other's research, which is actually really good for medicine. Upset Koch a little bit, but either way, Koch now gets back into the laboratory and he sets about trying to discover the first germ that causes a human disease, and he does that. He discovers tuberculosis. And once again, this kickstarts a new age. Scientists are rushing to try to discover a human disease, new human diseases. They're already out there. They're just trying to find the germ that causes specific diseases. And just here you can see some of the ones that were discovered throughout the late 1800s. Okay, so that is Robert Koch, and that leads us on to the last big discovery from Louis Pasteur, and that was it built upon his work with vaccines already. He now knows how vaccines work. He knows what Jenner did not know, and he sets about developing the first vaccine for a human disease, and that was the vaccine for rabies. It talks about that just down here. So Louis Pasteur, very, very important individual. Make sure you are aware of his work. Right, let's move on to another very, very important individual. Three individuals in fact, and that is Fleming, Florian Chain, and the discovery of the very first antibiotic. Once again, I would definitely be revising this bit. It's very important. So, Fleming. Just to recap briefly, Fleming was involved in World War I. He had studied soldiers' infected wounds. You imagine World War I in the trenches, you get shot by the German bullets, they take you to hospital, you survive being shot, but that bullet took all of the dirty uniform deep inside the body, and those microscopic fragments of dirt and material get left there after the bullet gets taken out. And you survive being shot by the German bullet, but then you develop a horrible infection and you die in hospital. So he had studied this, and after World War I, he had set his sights on trying to find a way of fighting infection deep inside the body. They were using carbolic acid as a way of treating infections in open wounds on the surface, but they couldn't fight the infection inside the body. And he was trying to find a method of killing the blood poisoning germ, Streptococci, there it is. I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciation of that. Staphylococci. Either way, okay, it's the germ that causes blood poisoning. And he spent 10 years researching this, and with limited luck. And then one day, pure chance, you could argue that he was a messy scientist and he'd left a number of Petri dishes in the sink. And one day when he came to the sink, he saw that mold had started to grow on the Petri dish. And the Staphylococci germs were not growing around the mold. They were around the edge of the dish, but the germs seemed to have been rather killed by the globule of mold. There were no germs around it. And you or I might just wash the mold away, blast it down the sink with a tap. But he noticed something that many others probably wouldn't, that this mold seemed to have germ-killing properties. And he did some experiments with this mold, and he discovered that it killed a number of different germs. But unfortunately, he didn't develop this treatment or this idea. Maybe we need a scientist to do it. Fleming, as a doctor / scientist, maybe lacked the skills, but he wrote about it, and that's the important thing. In 1929, he wrote about it, and it allowed others to read about his ideas. And if I scroll back up, we've got two very important scientists, Howard Florey and Ernst Chain, who stumble across Fleming's work in a library about 9 years later. And as soon as they read it, they realise that Fleming was onto something. That this mould seemed to have really, really exciting properties. And they set about trying to do some experiments on it. And they approached the British government and they got £25 because World War II was about to start and there was no money going spare. And they started to do their own experiments, and they realized that penicillin worked on mice. It would fight infections deep inside the body of a mouse. But they realized the problem. They needed so much more penicillin to treat a person than they did a mouse. Okay, they estimated 3,000 times more penicillin, and that equated to about 2,000 litres just for one person. 2,000 litres of kind of a mouldy juice to harvest pure penicillin. Now, this was going to be tricky, but they set about trying to grow this mold in their lab. They got milk churns and buckets and bedpans and bathtubs, and they set about trying to grow enough mold to treat one person. And luckily for them, that person came along. His name was Albert Alexander, and he had pricked his finger on a rose bush. Blood poisoning had set in, and unfortunately this was common. People died from grazing their knees, from pricking their fingers on rose bushes. Septicemia set in, which is a type of blood poisoning, which they simply could not treat. We could not treat before antibiotics, before penicillin. So they tried their penicillin on Albert Alexander and it worked. He got better, and then they ran out and an infection set back in. They recycled it from his urine and it worked, and then they ran out and the infection set back in, and then he died. But it did prove that penicillin worked if you could grow enough of it. And this is where luck kind of has it for Florey and Chain, because World War II is well and truly underway. They approach the big drug manufacturers to invest in penicillin, and those drug manufacturers and the government, the US government in particular, see the opportunity to help them win the war. Penicillin could now help them win the war. So the government invested huge amounts of money. They gave big loans to the drug companies that started to mass produce penicillin. And it definitely helped to save soldiers' lives, get them back onto the battlefield, and it helped the Allies win the war. It says there, by D-Day 1944, we had over 2.3 million doses of penicillin. And since World War II, the 70 years since World War II, it's estimated that penicillin has saved 200 million lives. That is an insane amount. It really is. And this is important. Okay, this is really, really important. Just like Pasteur is important, and just like Jenna, you will be able to use as part of a bigger question. Definitely revise this stuff. Okay. Right, what I'm going to do now is whip on to public health, because public health is very important. It's definitely coming up on your exam as part of a bigger factors question. And I'm just looking now at the mock exam. We have covered, once we do factors for public health, we have covered everything that is going to be on your mock and some other stuff, okay? But everything we've spoken about this morning, or everything on your mock, has been covered with what we have spoken about this morning. So definitely make most of this video, go back over it with the pause button, revise what I've been suggesting you revise. So let's have a little look at public health. Right, public health in the Middle Ages. Can you talk about how terrible it was and how the government introduced some new laws to make improvements, but unfortunately those new laws were not enforced? Let me just quickly go back to where it was. Here it is. Okay, so this page here. Then public health in the countryside, it was good, and the monasteries also had good public health. Then we took the Black Death and we said, look, there was some of a scientific approach, but most of the public health approaches regarding the Black Death was left up to individuals or local towns. There were some forms of very basic quarantine, but not much. Public health was still personal. Then we get to the Renaissance regarding public health. And there's not a good slide for this. And public health was worse. All of the same problems of the Middle Ages, okay, overcrowding, human and animal waste, people throwing waste onto the streets, into the rivers, people throwing chemicals into the rivers, animal waste, human waste in the rivers that you get your drinking water from, that cycle of disease and infection, disease and infection. Things were getting worse though during the Renaissance because of the massive overcrowding that the big cities were now experiencing. Regarding public health and disease infection, when a big disease such as the Great Plague came along, there was a more scientific and organised approach to it, which was important. We've got quarantine and women's searchers and the watchmen and the bills of mortality. These are important things. They banned the large gatherings of crowds, just like we're doing today with COVID. So a much more organised and scientific approach to disease and infection and public health in the Renaissance. But conditions were getting worse. Then we move to the industrial period. And this is where we see huge overcrowding like we've never seen before. More people moved to the cities than ever before to take advantage of the new jobs of the Industrial Revolution. We have back-to-back housing with these enclosed courtyards with only, I think I've counted these before, I think there are 11, but there are 4 there, 5 there, 9, 10, 11, 12 toilets for all of these houses. Over here, it says that they found 40 people sharing one room in Liverpool in the height of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so massive overcrowding. Still no toilets. A bucket for most families in the corner of the room. If there was a street toilet, it was a hole in the ground shared by many, many families. A water pump coming from the local pond or river that was already highly polluted. No rubbish collection, no street cleaners, no sewers, no fresh running water, sewage trickling into rivers. So make sure you can talk about the terrible public health conditions of the Industrial Revolution. Now, you already know, or at least you should already know, there's a public health factors question that will talk to you about the most important factor in the development of public health. So this is how bad it is. Now we need to think about why things improve. And I'm going to link all of this back to the factors question, the different factors. Now we know, you know, this is coming up. It's the public health year. And we know for certain, 99% sure, they are going to ask you how important was a factor in the development of public health compared with all the other factors. Okay, they want you to analyze a factor that they give you. Now, we don't know what factor they are going to give you. Well, I do, you don't. Okay, so you need to revise all of the factors. But in an ideal world, on the question, you'll write about 3. The factor that they give you, and then 2 other factors to show that breadth of knowledge. Okay, if you can. Otherwise, you write about 2 factors in detail. But let's say that you're going to write about 3 factors, the one that they give you and then 2 other ones. That means you can revise 2 in masses of detail, knowing that you're definitely going to write about them because they're your 2 that you're going to choose. You're going to have to write about 3. They're going to choose one, the exam board is going to choose one, and then you can choose 2 other ones. So in that instance, for public health, you should probably be revising the role of the government and individual brilliance. They are the 2 easiest ones to write about for public health from a factors point of view. Now, worst case scenario, they say how important was individual brilliance amongst the other factors. So you've got to write about individual brilliance, but you revise that in masses of detail anyway. Then you say, however, there are also other important factors, such as the role of the government, and you revise that in masses of detail anyway. So you've got 2/3 of your answer already prepared for your mock question, actually, for the biggest question on the paper. Hopefully you understand what I mean, and I'll talk to you more about this in class. But if you revise, individual brilliance and government, the 2 easiest ones to write about for public health, you know that you will definitely write about them on the exam. 100%, you'll end up writing about them on the exam. So in theory, you're preparing 2/3 of the answer. If you're going to write about 3 factors, you've revised 2 in stupid detail. Again, hopefully you know what I mean about that, and I will talk to you more about that in class if need be. So, the government's response to the public health situation. Well, laissez-faire. Where are you? That one. There it is, just up there. Laissez-faire attitude towards public health. It's French. Roughly means leave them alone. And that's been the government attitude throughout history. Let's not get involved in the way people live their lives. They live like that because they choose to. They're poor because they're lazy. They're poor because they're alcoholics or drug addicts. They can't be bothered to work. So why should we, the rich, pay to improve the lives of normal, smelly, poor people? That was the brutal attitude that the government and the rich had during this period. Also, it was only the rich could vote, so the government had a vested interest in protecting the opinions of the rich and not the poor. So, what pushed the government into action? Well, cholera. Cholera killed lots of people. It was the Black Death of the Industrial Revolution. It killed the rich, it killed the poor, and it was scary. People believed that it was miasma, bad air, that was causing cholera to spread. But they really didn't know. People still blamed it on God, they blamed it on the 4 humors, and it was a really horrible death. Most people died within 48 hours, and in 1831, 50,000 people died alone. Okay, miserable year for deaths. And then it kept coming back. Okay, it would go away almost as quickly as it came, but it kept coming back. Now that prompted, with the rich complaining about the increase in taxes to pay for the poor, prompted the government to employ Edwin Chadwick. And Edwin Chadwick did an investigation. He published a report called the Report on the Sanitary Conditions of the Labouring Population. And he basically said, look, if you want to improve living conditions, stop cholera coming back, but also save the rich money by lowering taxes that were used to pay for the poor, you want to lessen the number of poor, then you should clean up the cities. If you clean up the cities, there will be less poor claiming benefits. If there are less poor people claiming benefits, the rich save money in taxes, and it makes the rich happy. But to clean up the cities during the Industrial Revolution would have cost an absolute fortune. So the government kind of ignored what Chadwick was saying. They said, okay, that's good, thank you, but we can't tax the rich more now to clean up the cities because they're not going to vote for us when the next election comes around. So once again, the government chose to bury their heads in the sand and ignore the problem. But cholera kept coming back. And cholera doesn't discriminate. It was killing the rich, it was killing the poor. And for the first time, the government, because of cholera and the work of Chadwick, the government moved slightly away from their laissez-faire attitude, and they published the first Public Health Act. This is the government kind of dipping their toe into welfare reform. They're not jumping in at the deep end. They're just kind of dipping their toe into it. Who wants to join us at this late stage? Okay, so one of the things that the first Public Health Act did was it set up a central board of health, which is really important. For the first time in history, there is a board of health within the government looking at the health of the nation. It also, and I can summarize this much better, okay? It also gave local councils the power to improve sewers and provide clean water. It's not there, okay? It gave local councils the power to provide sewers and clean water if they wanted to. But to do that, they would have to raise taxes. Who would have to pay those taxes? The rich. Who votes? The rich. So local councils, let's say we were councillors of Bridgewater, we wouldn't necessarily want to raise taxes for our ratepayers to improve the lives of the poor because the poor can't vote. So we can just carry on ignoring them. So unfortunately, because the first Public Health Act, was not compulsory, not a lot happened. Most towns and councils ignored it. But it was a step in the right direction. So, if we're talking about individuals, we can talk about Chadwick as being an individual that improved public health. We can talk about the government that introduced the first Public Health Act as a factor in the improvement of public health. You can even talk about chance to a certain degree and argue that cholera was a chance occurrence. You couldn't ever have predicted that cholera was going to keep coming back, although you probably could have. And that also pushed the government towards acting and improving public health. So another individual, and if you're going to write about individual brilliance, this is a good one to choose. Another individual that impacted the development of public health was John Snow. John Snow was a doctor, and cholera had killed a number of people. And just by chance, you could argue, excuse me, just by chance, you could argue that cholera happened just on John Snow's doorstep, right in Broad Street. Excuse me. And it gave John Snow a chance to research it. And he approached it in a very scientific way, meticulous research. He took a map, he knocked on all of the doors in and around Broad Street, and he recorded the deaths and the sickness from cholera. What he quickly realized was that the highest concentration of deaths were around a particular water pump, the Broad Street pump. And his evidence was so strong that he convinced the council to remove the handle to that pump. And cholera in that area went away. Proof that water not miasma, was spreading cholera. Now, obviously, it takes a while for his ideas to catch on. It often does when people come up with new ideas, but eventually people do believe Jon Snow. Now, you would hope that this would be enough evidence to push the government towards acting again. They've given councils the power to provide clean water if they want, but the first Public Health Act was not compulsory. So you would hope that this would push the government towards action. It doesn't, because the poor can't vote. So why should we worry about improving the lives of the poor? We shouldn't. And that was the attitude. And then 1858, the Great Stink comes along, okay, where basically the River Thames stops flowing right next to Parliament. You would hope that that, combined with the evidence of Jon Snow, would push the government into action. It doesn't. Not yet, anyway. Okay. Then we get the work of Pasteur and germ theory, and even the work of Octavia Hill, more important individuals that push the government towards action. And still the government doesn't really act, drags its heels. We're crying out for a new Public Health Act. But then, and this shows how selfish the government is, in 1867, we have the Great Reform Act, where all working men are given the right to vote. It doesn't matter how poor they are, if they have a job, they can vote. So now the government thinks, oh, damn, we can no longer just look after the rich. Now we've got this massive group of voters, new voters, the poor, and we must look after them, otherwise they're not going to vote for us. And as a result of that, the second Public Health Act is passed. 1875, the second Public Health Act, which basically makes the first one compulsory. Towns and councils now have to provide people with sewage disposal and clean water. They're going to have to up taxes to pay for it, but this will keep the poor happy. Also, 1875, the Artisans' Dwelling Act, which gives towns and councils the power to knock down the slums and start to build good quality council houses. Okay, so the government acting again. This is what I mean when you're talking about factors regarding public health. The government and individuals are the obvious ones to focus on. They're the easiest ones. Another individual, but also the government. After 1858, the government started to build sewers, and by the second Public Health Act, the sewer building campaign in London had gathered huge pace, and many miles and even hundreds of miles of sewers were now being built. So this became known as the Great Clean-up, and it was all down to Joseph Bazalgette. Okay, it's Bazalgette's design, but the government gave Bazalgette $3 million to start building the sewers. So this is a very important aspect of the Great Clean-up. And another individual that made a difference, but also another government action that made a difference. And again, there's every chance you're going to write about this. Why wouldn't you write about this? Again, it's the easiest stuff. When we're talking about public health, it's always government versus individual. Okay. So let's continue. You could also talk about science and technology here, okay? If it wasn't for development within building techniques, the sewers would have not been as effective as they were. It talks there about it removing 420 million gallons of sewage every single day. A gallon is roughly 8 pints. So 420 million gallons. It's a lot of pints, isn't it? If you think of a pint of beer, a pint of sewage, not quite the same appeal. Okay, so yes, that is the Great Clean-up, Bazalgette, and up to the second Public Health Act. Right, really briefly now, what we've got, 15 more minutes. Good. Let's keep going. More government stuff and war, in fact. Right, let's have a little think now of public health throughout the 1900s, the 20th century. Now, the Boer War happened on the turn of the century, 1899 through to 1902. And this helps to indicate how bad things were. The fact that 38% of all recruits were rejected because they were not healthy enough. Now, you could argue up until the Second Public Health Act, the government really didn't care about the health of the nation. They cared more after the Reform Act, where all working men got the right to vote. But now the health of the nation is affecting our ability to fight and win wars. 38% of volunteers could not fight. The government would be worried about that. And it's stuff like this that pushes the government towards action again. So you could argue that war played a part in the improvement of public health. So things were getting better, but they were not perfect yet. Okay, so another individual that pushed the government towards action throughout the 1920s, not 1920s, sorry, throughout the 20th century, so the 1900s, was Sebon Rowntree. He did a study, it was called Poverty, a Study of Town Life. And you could argue this is communication as well as individual brilliance, because he wrote down his ideas for others to read about and to act upon. Now, he worked in York. He was part of the Rowntree dynasty, so he owned factories. He was a very, very wealthy individual. And he did a study in York, and he found out that a quarter of people in York lived in poverty, even though they had a job. Now, he felt that this was wholly unfair. How could you have a job and work all sorts of horrible hours, long hours, and still be poor? He said this was very, very unfair. And what he's highlighting are issues to do with a minimum wage. Up until this point, governments have tended to focus on the practical things of public health, like clean water and sewage disposal. And those are important, but there are many, many other things that keep people poor and keep people unhealthy. And working conditions are one such area, especially a minimum wage. So he increased his own wages for his own workers and also put pressure on the government to do the same. Somebody else who also pushed the government towards action throughout the early 1900s is Charles Booth. Just like Sebon Rowntree, he did a study which highlighted some of the issues that nobody was really talking about or just simply didn't know. So Booth, he was quite rich, and he did a study in London because he felt that the campaigners were wrong. He felt that the campaigners were exaggerating when they said that a quarter of Londoners lived in poverty. How the hell could 1 out of every 4 people in London live in poverty in the late 1800s? He felt it was impossible. It couldn't be that bad. So he financed research into London, especially the East End. He spent weeks living in the area, doing investigations, knocking door to door. And what he discovered shocked him. And it also shocked the people of Britain and even the government. He found that 35% of Londoners lived in poverty. That's 1 out of every 3. It's more than 1 out of every 3 people live in poverty. And that's shocking. And it's information like that that pushes the government towards taking responsibility and acting. And that's exactly what happens. From 1906 onwards, we get a new Liberal government. A Liberal government who's voted by the people to protect the people. The old government was a Conservative government that had been in power for a long time, and the Conservative government had developed a reputation as only looking after the interests of the rich, and they still have that reputation today. The Liberal government was a government for the people, and as soon as they were elected into power, they started to introduce new public health reforms. 1906, free school meals for children in need, something we still have today. 1907, medical checks to be carried out on children in schools. Sometimes A child had never seen a doctor in his or her entire life during this period. So to actually see a doctor in school was an important step forward. 1908, a Pension Act. So people could retire if they did hit 70. They simply were not working to the moment they died. 1911, a National Insurance Act to help with sick pay, where you will pay a part of your wages into a kitty every month, as does the government and your employer. And enables people to get sick pay, because before sick pay, if you're off with a broken leg, then your employer is going to find somebody else to fill that role because you can't do it. That means you lose your job. That means you can't pay your rent. That means you're kicked out and you're forced to go and live on the streets or in the slum. That affects your health even further and you can't get a job in the future. It's a horrible cycle of poverty, and sick pay and the National Insurance Act helped to cut down on that. So again, government actions that improved public health. Definitely be thinking about these. Right. So developments now in the 30s. So after World War One. Now, World War One was good and bad for public health, because after World War One, we have a drive to build homes fit for heroes. A new Housing Act became law. David Lloyd George, the same David Lloyd George from the Treaty of Versailles, had promised the returning soldiers homes fit for heroes. And as a result, throughout the 1930s, the unhealthy, the horrible slum housing was knocked down and new good quality council houses were built. 700,000 by the 1930s. So he meant business with this. And again, it's important for public health because it's not just sewers, it's not just clean water. Now we are recognizing that housing, or at least poor quality housing, impacts people's health. So that was good. The bad side of World War One was mass unemployment. The returning soldiers were coming back and they did not have jobs to come back to. When they were in the army, they got their meals, they got their accommodation, they got their clothing. It was all paid for them. Now they're coming back and it's mass unemployment, and that impacts the health of the people. If you look just briefly at the death rates, it actually increases throughout the 1930s. It's been decreasing from World War One right up until this period, and this is the period where mass unemployment hits people hard. So things are getting better, but there is still room for improvement. World War II actually helps with those improvements massively. So again, war impacting the development of public health. War seems to be like a good one that you could potentially talk about alongside individual brilliance and governments. So World War II, how did it help? Well, it was a major conflict where people felt united like never before. The people that lived in Britain that were not away fighting, they felt united under this common banner to fight the Germans. And there was this feeling across the nation that we are all in it together. And everybody deserved access to good medical care, not just the super rich. And because of this, many people did get free healthcare, especially in the big cities that were being bombed by the Germans. It seems a bit unfair for your house to get blown up. You maybe lose a number of your family members. You break a leg and then you have to pay to have that leg fixed. So there was lots of free healthcare during this period of war. Also, children from the cities were evacuated to the countryside, where many more rich, affluent people lived. The countryside was full of the middle classes and the upper classes. And for many of them, they'd never seen the conditions that an inner city street kid had to live through. And here they were now, these street children, on the doorsteps of these rich, affluent, middle class people. And sometimes these children from the cities, they didn't have shoes. They might have had one shoe. They were covered in dirt or clothing that was clearly too big for them. Some of them didn't know how to use a toilet, and when they needed to relieve themselves, would do it outside of the front door. This shocked a whole group of people that had never seen this before, and those people put pressure on the government to make a change, to make improvements. Okay. And another really important person throughout World War II that put pressure on the government to make improvements was William Beveridge, who published the Beveridge Report in 1942. Now, William Beveridge was an important civil servant. He was a sir. He'd been knighted by the king. Okay, so the guy was respected. And he did an investigation into why people are still poor during this period. And he suggests something very, very radical. His report is nicknamed the Cradle to the Grave Plan. And he suggests that it's the government's responsibility to look after people from the moment they are born, the cradle, to the moment they die, the grave. Now, this is so far away from laissez-faire, it's unreal. Laissez-faire, the government does not get involved in the way people live their lives. Now, the Cradle to the Grave Plan, he's suggesting that the government is responsible for us from the moment we are born to the moment we die. And there is more that the government should be doing in looking after the health of the nation. Now, all of this combines to push the government towards introducing the NHS. So 1948, the government introduces the NHS. For the first time, people have access to free medical treatment. It's an interesting stat there where it says in 1948, up until that point, 8 million people had never seen a doctor before. Never, ever, ever. They dealt with all of their own problems. Toothache, growths, cysts, tumours, whatever the problem was, they simply could not afford to see a doctor. Now they could. And you can see in the spider diagram just next to it, some of the services that are available to, and still are available today when needed. Vaccinations, family doctors, dentists, specialists, free hospital care, free treatments. And the person that introduced the NHS was Nye Bevan, Aneurin Bevan, the first Minister of Health of the Labour government. In his crowning glory was the introduction of the NHS. So, ladies and gents, I'm going to leave it there because everything that I have just mentioned, not everything I've just mentioned, sorry, everything that's going to be on your mock exam, I have mentioned this morning. Make sure you are very well versed in the factors question because that is one that you can predict. Regarding disease and infection, you need to know the big characters. You need to know how disease and infection was being practiced and treated throughout the Middle Ages. You also need to know disease and infection throughout the Renaissance, try everything through to the industrial period. So that also covers Jenner and Pasteur and Koch and Fleming and Florian Chain. So you need to definitely be revising that. There's a significance question that will ask you to explain the significance of something, a period. You will have to compare that to a different part of the world as well. There's a similarities question. How are individuals similar? One similarity that you could always talk about, whether it's periods or individuals, is that new ideas are being discovered. If you're doing a similarities question on two different periods, you could argue that in both periods new ideas are being discovered. If it's individuals are usually coming up with new ideas, so that's one of the angles that you can take on the similarities question. But I need more than one similarity. You can't just write about one and expect to get the best marks. There's a useful question where they give you a source which shows you a picture and asks you what it shows you about medicine in that period, and you'll need to use the source but also describe and explain using your own knowledge. And yeah, I'll talk to you more about how to structure answers when we get back into class. So please use this. I will download it now. When I stop it, I will download it and upload it to YouTube, and you'll be able to rewatch this at a later date with the pause button, and hopefully it will be able to guide your revision over the Easter holidays. It's not a question of having to revise everything, but a lot of it is there. I've covered everything that's going to be on your mock. And I know I've left some stuff out as well. We haven't done the development of surgery and anatomy from the industrial period onwards. So we haven't spoken about Lister and James Simpson and anesthetics and antiseptics. We haven't mentioned about aseptic surgery. Okay, so that bit has been missed out. We haven't had time for that, but that shouldn't affect your revision at all. Okay, so I'm going to bid you all farewell now. I'm going to go back to Teams. I'm going to end the meeting pretty much straight away and then upload this to YouTube. So take care, everybody. Thank you for so many of you joining in. And yeah, take care, Josh. Thank you. I'll see you soon, mate. I'll talk to you all in class. Help you out more then. Bye-bye.